Hey everyone, thanks so much for joining us on this Q&A. From the webinar that we had around synthetic data, there were so many questions that came up that Chris and I wanted to take some time and answer those directly. So we're going to do a little bit of a Q&A style format on those questions. So Chris, you'll be the main event here. So I'll ask you the questions. The first one that came in was, what are the risks of over-relying on synthetic data in critical applications? Can synthetic data introduce or amplify biases present in real data it's modeled after?
Yeah, that's a really good question. And one of the things I want to really emphasize is that this is something we've always had an issue with. The question is where does our data come from, and is it appropriate for the kind of thing we're doing? And absolutely, especially at the moment, as we're in the early days of synthetic data, we shouldn't be using it as the final mission critical data to make a big decision. However, if we're trying to understand a little bit more, get a little bit more nuance about a product, how it's used, how it's seen, that kind of thing, it's very appropriate for that kind of use. So it's very much a horses for courses. I know that people are making wild claims about synthetic data, but for now at least, we should be using it cautiously, but just making sure it's appropriate for the kind of thing we want to do. One of the things I've been advocating is to use it before doing more quant, so more traditional quant. So maybe run a quick question on a cohort or something like that before doing some quant, so that you understand better what you want to ask, what you want to have in that quant. So at that point, you're not really putting yourself at risk. You're just moving things along faster. So very much at the moment, we should be looking at what are we trying to achieve, and is this appropriate?
Yeah, so not utilizing it in every use case, but I think that over-relying is like the key word there, right? Like don't over-rely on it, but use it in the correct use case. Got it. Another one that is, I think, a little bit similar, but maybe has some different answers is, what makes you confident you aren't overstating significance of biasing results when you generate synthetic data? So again, kind of around that, like, what makes you confident in those results from synthetic data?
Yeah, and again, so as you say, that this follows on from the previous answer, like, are you using it appropriately? And at the moment, we're using the data very much in a directional form, much in the same way as we would use qual data. You know, qual data is hugely useful, but you can't really talk about significance when you're working with qual data. And I would recommend, for now at least, using the same kind of lens when you're looking at the data, so that we're not actually, we're not overstating the significance, we're not using it in an inappropriate way, but just saying, yeah, this is actually giving us an idea, giving us some insight into what's going on. Is it statistically significant? Probably not. At this point for particular things, but it's helping us move along the insights journey.
Yeah, makes sense. And so kind of along the same lines, you know, there's a lot of question about the reliability of synthetic data. Do you have kind of the same answer for that when people talk about reliability?
Yeah, definitely. And it's a watch this space as well, because I think, you know, as we're refining our techniques for generating synthetic data, we've already made a lot of progress in terms of how representative it is by using better techniques. And that will get better and better as we go down. But yes, for now, just being very aware, we're at the early stages. We shouldn't be putting mission critical things, using the data for that. However, for moving our insights forward, it's very appropriate.
Got it. And then along the same lines, I guess, is around, you know, validating the synthetic data. John had a question that was, you know, has synthetic data been validated to accurately reflect what a real pool of respondents would have answered or said in the same way? I know during the webinar you referenced a study with Cornell where 85% reliable. do you recommend doing that validation, and how often do you recommend doing that?
Yeah, and so that's basically the way we're doing the validation is by basically holding out questions. So what we're doing is we are generating synthetic personas or cohorts based on data, withholding some questions, so not using those questions in the training of it, but then using them to validate, saying, do we get the same answer as we did? And that's kind of the basic way that we're validating how close to the original data we're staying. Like I say, that's something where we're seeing increases in ability. We're seeing increases in the correspondence between the synthetic data and the original data. So we are making progress on that, but this is definitely something that needs to keep happening. A lot of it depends on how broad a data set you have to begin with, how deep a data set. But yeah, this is the way that we're going to be keeping ourselves honest, because as I said, you know, these systems are designed to be plausible. And of course, plausible means it can be spitting anything else but it looks good. So we have to keep ourselves honest and making sure that we're keeping that correspondence with the original data.
Yeah, that makes sense. And along the same lines, Peyton asked a question around, does this technology hallucinate data? I think the biggest knock I hear, at least one of the biggest knocks on, AI or with ChatGPT and so forth is around hallucination. Does this data hallucinate? If so, at what rate? What are your thoughts around that?
Yeah, hallucination's an interesting thing, and as I said, I'm not hugely fond of the term because it implies something's going on that isn't. It's not really hallucinating. It's just a poor retrieval. Is really a better way of looking at it. One of the things I say, and it may be a little bit glib, but one of the things I say is if hallucination is a problem to you, you're probably using the system wrong. So the common examples of hallucination are the lawyers who used it to write their court briefs, and then when it quotes hallucinated, they got very upset and got into a lot of trouble. but that was really because it was being used inappropriately. It was a misunderstanding of how the systems work. So it's not, when we generate synthetic data, it's not so much that we get hallucination, it's that we might actually be moving further away from the base data than we should. We're extrapolating too far, if you like, using the kind of terms we would have used. So yes, we need to make sure that it's not, that we're not using it inappropriately and we're not doing that extrapolation too far away from the base data. But it's not really hallucination per se, as it is just saying we're using it inappropriately. So like I say, I tend to say if hallucination becomes a problem to you, you probably need to step back and say, are we using this appropriately? And is there a better way to use these techniques?
Got it. Makes sense. And then, so what's your checklist, or what are your guidelines for like a go, no-go decision on whether it's a good fit for a project or not?
Yeah, I mean, pretty much. So there's an old technique known as the theory of value of information, and if people aren't familiar with that, I think it's worth looking that up and actually going back. And this is something that's true for all research, not just for synthetic data. But basically what happens when you look at the theory of the value of information, basically what you look at is what's the decision point and what's the value of getting the decision right, the value of getting the decision wrong, and the difference between those two, and then saying how much should we spend to reduce the risk in the decision. So, and that can get actually very mathematical, very complex very quickly, which is probably why it's not used as much as it should be. But basically it's saying, are you spending the right amount of money to reduce the risk in the decision. And basically we're going to, and that's true with all research. I mean, if you're trying to understand whether you're going to put all the tooling together to put out a product, and the tooling's going to cost you millions of dollars, you need to be spending a lot of money on the research. Okay. If you're trying to understand something which is maybe a little softer, maybe a little easier to fix if you don't get the wrong decision, like maybe just the wording on a package or something like that, which is very important, but doesn't have quite the same catastrophic effect, then maybe you can spend less on the research. And I think we're going to see a reversion to the same kind of thing, where we say, okay, given the value of the decision, is synthetic data going to get us far along the insights road enough that we can make that decision better? And if not, we should be using other techniques. We should be, using more conventional techniques. But if it is good enough, then we should be using it. So I think it's just being very mindful about the outcomes and the costs, and weighing up that equation of the costs versus the outcomes.
Got it. How big is the problem, right?
Exactly. Yeah. At the end of the day, it's what's the consequence of the decision that you're supporting. If the consequence is such, because very often, and this is the old, agility and design thinking type way of doing things, is say, let's make a quick decision because there's more value in getting to market quickly than there is about spending a year getting it absolutely right, because by the time you've taken a year to do that, your competitors have moved on. So it's, that trade-off. Sometimes it's more important to move quickly in a market than it is to get absolutely the right decision.
Got it. Makes sense. And then there were two questions, Chris, that came in around data quality, and they're interesting questions. They're both different. So I'll ask them, but just to give you a little bit of context here. And so the first one is, it's kind of a statement, but I think there's a question within the statement, isn't synthetic data, and synthetic data is in quotes here, just a means to reduce research costs and save more time than a valid tactic to actually improve the quality of data? And so I'll leave it there. And then we have another question that came up around this is, how can synthetic data identify and compensate for poor quality, such as, cheaters, small sample, etc. So what say you? I guess in that.
Yeah, no, those are good questions. In terms of the first one, I mean, is it about getting the very best quality, or is it about moving fast and cost effectively? I think at the moment it's about moving fast and cost effectively, not about getting. The gold standards are still going to be the ways we're currently doing things. Using high quality sample, those kind of things. And so I think that will always be, or will for now at least be, the gold standard and something we would go to. And as I mentioned on the webinar, there are some things, like if you're the government trying to work out, the propensity of heroin use in a particular neighborhood, you're going to use even more expensive techniques to get those. You're not going to do that through panel sample. So there's always been this trade-off of the cost of sample, or cost of the people we're talking to, versus the speed and accessibility. And at the moment, synthetic data is definitely down the high accessibility, high speed, lower cost, move quickly kind of thing. So I think that mostly we're going to see it being used for that agility. And like I say, one of the ways that I've been advocating using it is to do a quick turn test before doing deeper insights, so that you can really focus the insight, the more traditional qualitative and quantitative studies, having done this. So I see this mostly as part of a process at the moment. So I would say that yes, it's more about agility and cost than it is about
Mhm.
getting the deepest data at the moment. And
Mhm.
again, I think we'll see that shift over time. The second part of the question about the what about the quality of the data you're building on top of? Absolutely, that's a really big deal.
Mhm.
One of the things for the synthetic cohorts I've been generating, we've had to go back and do a really deep dive into the quality of the data to make sure that we're not using underlying data that is itself generated by a bot or by a cheater or whatever,
Right. Right.
those whole things, because otherwise you will just perpetuate and amplify those, and I think this circularity is potentially a problem. So you do have to be working from very high quality data, but the higher quality of the underlying data, the better quality the synthetic data is going to be. And there's no free lunch here. Whoever asked the question is absolutely right. If
Mhm.
you're building this on top of data which is suspect in any way, you're not going to get great results at the end.
Got it. So garbage in, garbage out still applies here,
Still apply.
huh? Got it. So part of this is, there's a synthetic data and augmented data. How do you determine the difference? Augmented data to me kind of sounds like waiting, but I think there's a little bit probably more to it. What's the
Yeah,
difference to you between synthetic data and augmented data, and are there appropriate use cases for each one?
yeah, and in reality, pretty much all of the things I've been talking about as synthetic data is really augmented data,
Okay.
because we're always starting from the viewpoint of starting with a base truth, where that base
Mhm.
truth may be the text of an IDI, or it may be the response to a quantitative survey, or whatever. We're
Yeah.
always kind of augmenting. There are ways to generate data which is more completely synthetic. So, for instance, one of the things you can say is, okay, here's one example of an individual. Give me 20 more like this.
Mhm.
Okay, that then would be purely synthetic when we did that, because we're not just augmenting the data, we're actually generating new individuals in the
Mhm.
process. That's doable. And in fact, similar techniques are actually being used by the big AI companies when they're building the models at the moment, where they're saying, "Hey, we're running out of data. We need new data. Let's generate it."
Mhm.
Microsoft just announced 5.4, which is their latest small model, and that's all based on synthetic data of that kind.
Mhm.
So there is work going on in that. I would say for research, for insights, for now, really augmented data is what we should be working with. In other words, there's always a ground truth set of data from an individual or whatever that we are building on top of and developing from.
Got it. And I guess a more holistic question, and you kind of alluded to it, was going to be the next question. So maybe you're an AI model already. Are AI models running out of data? Like, what's your take there?
Yeah, and it's a problem.
Mhm.
The big models have pretty much sucked up all the data that's happening, and
Mhm.
then what we're getting is this kind of poisoning of the well, where if you go on the web now, if you at random go to 20 websites, 5 of those are going to be AI generated.
Right.
I'm making that number up, but it's
Mhm.
probably of that order. And that's a problem, because this, of course, is the data that is being used to generate the models. And we're now at a stage where it's very hard to know what the underlying data is. A lot of the original, so the GPT models, the OpenAI GPT models,
Mhm.
a large part of their training data came from Reddit. Well, if you look on Reddit now, a lot of the posts there are bot generated, and so that is definitely an issue. It is something that the people who are building the larger models worry about. I mentioned Microsoft and 5.4, their latest small model, which is a very interesting model. They're generating synthetic data to actually train that. So, yeah, there's a little bit of what's it called? An Ouroboros, the snake that's eating his own tail. There's a little bit of that going on at the moment, and I think that's definitely a concern.
Got it. That makes sense. How, we're talking obviously about synthetic data or augmented data, wherever you want to define it. When do you see this becoming more like mainstream, if you will? I think right now it feels like small pockets of people are utilizing it and playing around with it. And, there's obviously these use cases, but when do you see this becoming more of like mainstream where someone, researcher just kind of picks it up and it's part of their, in their toolbox, so to speak?
I think it will become mainstream first in two areas. Okay. One is in synthetic personas for bringing to life segments and individuals. I think we're at the stage where even now, even with all the caveats, we're already at the point where that's something people can do and people can rely on because they understand the limitations. So I think that can happen now, and I think we'll see that will become the norm. When somebody does a segmentation, they will, they've got a 6-segment solution. I think what will happen is we will see, as well as the 6 PowerPoint slides that are now delivered for that 6-segment solution, there will also be 6 personas. I think that's already beginning to happen. We're seeing that, but I think that will become fairly mainstream quite quickly. It's just something that people will do. I think the other area where we'll see it become mainstream very soon is in upfront research planning. And what I mean by that is, say I've got a new product and I want to run some product tests and things like that. I think that we will continue to do that the traditional way. However, before we actually design the survey even, we will run through a cohort or something and say, hey, tell me what you think. Because I think what will happen is we'll start using that every day to actually help us design the survey. Because we'll say, okay, what do people talk about? What do people care about? Oh, have we thought about this? Do we have the right number of options for this question? So I think we'll see it as pre-quant fairly soon. I think that will become very common very soon.
Got it. That makes sense. Yeah, that makes sense. And I think a good way to, to kind of end the Q&A, Chris, is around, confidence. I think clients need to have confidence in the data. And Susan has a good question here that we can use it and wrap up after this one. What recommendations do you have, on explaining and building confidence with clients about synthetic data, beyond the cost savings?
So I think the most important thing is to be open and upfront when you're using it. I worry a little bit that some companies may see this as a shortcut, like, okay, let's do this. So I think that, understanding the limitations, being very upfront with our clients, with our stakeholders, with everybody, how it's being used, when it's being used, and why it's appropriate to use it that way. I think that there is a danger of, I do see some over promises around in the market. I do see some people who are saying, this is the end of panel, and we're never ever going to need to do that. And hey, we can give you, and the reality is we are nowhere near there as an industry yet. And I think that will cause people to lose confidence because some of the wild claims that we see. So I would say the main thing from the confidence point of view is just being open and upfront. One of the things I try to do is to be very clear about what the limitations are.
Yeah.
But it's not like, sometimes people see limitations and say, oh, so we should never use it. And I'm saying, no, there are limitations. Let's understand those. And then let's use it for the areas where it works really well. So things like I just mentioned, the pre-quant tests and the personas, 2 areas where it performs great. Let's use it for that. Let's not pretend we can use it for areas where it's not quite ready yet.
That's interesting. Awesome. Well, thank you, Chris, for taking the time to answer all these questions. I'm sure the attendees and people that submitted it are grateful as well. And with that, we can go ahead and wrap up this Q&A. Thank you.
Thank you.